So Paul wrote this, and he had to deal with Nero. And those were very, very dark days for Christians. We've spoken about this in the past before, but some of Nero's tactics against believers. First of all, Nero himself, it's suspected, set Rome on fire and burned half the city down. But the thing is, he blamed it on the Christians. He used the Christians as scapegoats because he figured they wouldn't fight back, and they didn't. And so what entertaining ways did Rome embrace Christians and welcome them and give them a big hug? They would dip them in pitch and tar. They would impale them rectally on poles, and they would light them and use them as candles in their gardens for their orgies. They would dress you in animal skins, and then for entertainment, bring you into a small Colosseum area and unleash a pack of wild dogs on you, and for entertainment and sport, watch you being torn apart piece by piece. How did they give you a big hug, big Roman hug? The gladiatorial sports, well, they certainly needed to practice. So what better way to practice than with moving targets? So they would practice their techniques of death blows and kills and strikes and amputations and decapitations using believers. This is the environment. This is the environment that they're operating in, that Paul wrote this in. So, wow, Paul, I don't think wrote this in a vacuum. Now, I already mentioned the exception. No government has a right to command your conscience. So, as we've mentioned before, there will be times when a believer must, by obeying God, you're going to incur the wrath of man. At least you're not incurring the wrath of God. When you rebel against authorities and you don't have a really solid reason for doing that, and you fabricate something or rationalize something, you're incurring God's wrath and the wrath of the government. But there are a few times when you're going to be told to do something that you cannot do because it violates God's command. And what are you supposed to do? You're going to pay the penalty. You're going to follow God, and you're going to try to do it without complaint, even though it may mean that you're treated the way these Roman Christians were treated. Under William MacDonald writes, under no circumstances should we ever rebel against a government or join in an attempt to overthrow it. January 6th. Not as Christians. We have no wiggle room on this, guys. Paul never gave us, God never gave us. You can search the scriptures to and fro. You will never find an example where that is blessed of God. Now, again, does this mean we're never to disobey the authorities? Are we never to say no? Absolutely not. Again, Peter and John are told, don't speak of Jesus. And they say, hey, we got to obey God rather than man. But they dealt with the consequences. The issues for them were never political. They were only spiritual. So, yep. Sometimes you got to stand up to the authorities when they're directly telling you to contradict God's authority. But make sure that when you decide to follow such a course of action, that you have the scriptures that you need in context. You have them rightly discerned, and it's not just a feeling to back you up, and you better be prepared to face the consequences. But at least in this consequences, the wrath won't be God's, it'll be man's. Wow. Okay, let's move on to 3 to 4. It gets worse, actually, as we get deeper into this. Paul continues, for rulers, the rulers that he's appointed, they're not a terror to good works, but they're a terror to evil, Paul writes. he asked this rhetorical question. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he, wow, he's talking about the authorities, and this is any type of authority over you. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he, the government authority, does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister. What does he use the sword for? As an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Now we'll offend the rest of you. Paul says, do what is good and you'll have praise. Paul's idea again is that Christians, no matter what type of government you're under, you need to try to be the best citizens that you possibly can, given the government that you have. Even though you know your loyalty lies with God, God wants you to be a good citizen. And you're a good citizen because you're honest, you don't give the state any trouble, you pay your taxes. Oh, and now we're going to take that wound and we'll take a little bit of that real salt and we'll rub it in there. And biblically, God tells you that you're to pray for your leaders, whether you like them or not, whether you agree with them or not, whether you like their decisions, whether they render decisions against you or not, you're to pray for your leaders. Oh, by the way, it gets better as we go on. We're not, wait till we get to the respecting the authorities. So let's look how God describes the government. He describes them as God's minister. I'm not trying to take anything away from Pastor Ken, who went to seminary and so forth, but government officials have a plan in the administration of God just as much as church leaders do. Now, doesn't that mess you up to think that the IRS agent in biblical context is God's minister? What? That city councilman that's such a moron that passed that ordinance that affected your property and caused that idiot neighbor next to you. Oh, wait a minute. That, according to the Bible, is God's minister. We need to remember as Christians that state, city, county, national leaders are ministers of God. And those ministers need to remember they are servants of the living God. They are not gods themselves. History is just complete with rulers who elevated themselves into the role of deity. I mean, most of the pharaohs considered themselves deity. Many of the Caesars considered themselves deity. They've totally lost it. Totally lost it. Because they don't recognize the role. They're servants of God. They're ministers of God. Doesn't change our response. That they're accountable, though, is the point, guys. They're not getting away with this scot-free being bad rulers. So Paul uses this example of a sword. For he, the government authorities, doesn't bear the sword in vain. What is he talking about? Because the role of government, he writes here, is an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. This is the role of government. What type of wrath? What kind of an avenger? A sword. A sword. The sword is a reference to capital punishment. In the Roman Empire, if you think that to execute criminals, they were crucified, that's actually not how the majority of criminals were executed during the Roman Empire. They wouldn't have enough trees. The most common form of execution during the time that Paul wrote this in Rome was beheading through a sword, by a sword. Paul specifically used a sword as an example. Lynn, I think that's overreaching to say that has to refer to capital punishment. It just means a symbol of authority. No, He specifically said sword. He could have used scepter. He could have used any other word. Remember, this is not Paul writing this. This is God writing this through Paul. He specifically used sword because sword was the way people were, how capital punishment was exercised. Crucifixion was reserved for when they wanted to make an example out of somebody, a display out of something. And it, frankly, no disrespect to Jesus, but it was really reserved for the lower caste people. Most people, Paul included as a Roman citizen, were beheaded when they were executed. So God says, this is not some innocuous symbol of power. I chose sword because that's the ultimate power of a ruler, to take someone's life. Now, you could come back and say, oh, Lynn, capital punishment, that was strictly the law in the Old Testament. That doesn't apply to us in the New Testament. What are you going to do with Romans 13? I have another way to dispute that too. I'll get to it in a minute. But this is in the New Testament, guys. It's still talking about this in the New Testament. Capital punishment as a mechanism for the state to enforce its rules is ordained by God. Here we go. There we go. Nobody's going to like that one. Well, I still think it's an Old Testament principle, Lynn. I think it was given in the law, and we're not under the law, we're under grace. Really? Well, let's see. Where was government established biblically? When were instructions given biblically for government? It was in Genesis 9, long before there was ever a law given to Moses. It predates the law. It's a principle that isn't tied to the law. It's tied to human beings. Genesis 9:6 is your text. Do you want to jot that down? It says, I'll read it to you, it's brief. Whoever sheds man's blood by man, in other words, by another human being, his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God, God has made man. So God gave one word, one command concerning the way people are to function over other people, government. And that is, you are supposed to function as a deterrent to evil through the ultimate implementation of capital punishment. You take a man's life through murder, your life will be taken by another person as punishment. That's Genesis 9:6. You can go read that forward and backwards and sideways and try to wiggle around with that. Now, that may sound harsh to you, but the fact remains that after God watched the lives of man before the days of Noah, with all the evil and debauchery and violence and promiscuity and wickedness, he said, you know what? After the days of Noah, from now on, I'm going to let mankind share the responsibility to police and govern itself. And he gave this command in Genesis 9:6. Now, man has failed in this terribly because we have not taken this command seriously, and we have moved capital punishment completely out of most of our states. And we've substituted life imprisonment. But and again, I'm not going off on a side rabbit trail here because Paul talks about it. I have to talk about it. In Genesis 9:6, he could have given any instructions he wanted to about government, guys. He could have talked about the parliamentary system versus republicanism. He could have talked about capitalism versus socialism. And you don't see God talking anything about that in Genesis 9:6. What did he talk about? Very simple. The one thing that I want you guys to remember when you govern yourself is there must be the taking of a life when someone snuffs out the life of another. Now, when you embrace that, understand that, and you carry that out, it has a ripple effect to the whole legal system. The legal system has teeth. That's the message you send. There will be consequences if you are evil and break the laws. I'm going to read you an opinion piece by John Corson. This is his writing. This is not mine, but on the same thought. He said, when this principle breaks down, frustration and anarchy are imminent. He writes, true government exists for the deterrence of evil through the reality of capital punishment. Once a nation or society begins to chuck capital punishment, the whole system then begins to unravel. He says, case in point, he wrote this 19 years ago, by the way. Case in point, the USA. It's almost going to seem prophetic at some points. If you're following geopolitical trends, you know that Islam is sweeping the world. This may not make sense to a lot of us, especially to women under Islam. Look at a country like England, he cites, and you'll see Islam is growing at a phenomenal rate. Analysts say there's one fundamental reason for this. People tired of crime and lawlessness. People know that Islam deals with crime swiftly and with finality. Under Islamic justice, if a man rapes a woman, he's castrated immediately. If a person is found shoplifting, he loses his hand immediately. Whoever kills a man dies by the hand of another. Whether you agree with this or not, and this is not a testimony, Corson says, to Islamic belief, but he said, whether you agree with this or not isn't even the issue. The fact is, people around the world are turning to a false religion that promises, because it promises order, structure, and protection, because their own government seems increasingly unable or unwilling to do so, end quote. So, enough on capital punishment. I'll close out this section and then we get to our last couple of verses. Whether you're a governor, a city councilman, mayor, judge, your role as a minister of God, whether you recognize God or not, carries great weight and responsibility. You will be judged more seriously because of how you exercise that authority. But our role as Christians, we respect the authority. I'll give you one more example of this by telling you a story. Paul loves stories. When David, young David, before he was king, Samuel comes to him and says, King Saul's totally off the rails. I'm going to anoint you. You're going to be God's next king. Okay? But it's not right now, but you're the future king. Saul gets wind of this, King Saul, very wicked man at this point. He begins to try to kill David, hunts him, chases him relentlessly throughout the Middle East. David's constantly on the run from King Saul. Well, you're not going to be able to write all of this down, but the way David referred to King Saul during all this period of time, wicked, the man's trying to kill him, he always referred to him as the Lord's anointed. 1 Samuel 24:6, 24:10, 26:9, 26:11, 26:16, 26:23, the Lord's anointed. In spite of the fact that this wicked king was trying to take out David, David didn't try to rationalize, justify anything. He still respected the office. And not only that, there was numerous times, sorry, Donna, sorry, Linda, there was a time King Saul came into a cave to take a leak. and David's men were hiding in the shadows, they could have killed Saul. And David forbid his men from ever harming King Saul because he was the Lord's anointed. David understood this principle that when it's time for wicked King Saul to be taken out, God will take care of it. Until then, I respect the office. The guy's trying to kill you. Chucked a spear at your head. That's kind of heavy. All right, closing out 5-7. Therefore, Paul concludes, Christians, you must be subject, not only because of the wrath that you fear, not only because of the wrath of government or the wrath of God, but you must be subject also for conscience sake, your own conscience. For because of this, oh, you're going to love this. You also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to do this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are due, fear to whom fear is due, and honor to whom honor is due. That concludes Paul's writings on the subject of our role with government in Romans 13. So, what's a Christian to do? And we'll wrap it up. No matter the government that you find yourself in, my job, my business at hand is to get out the word of God. My business, as best as I can, is to be a good citizen and obey the law. That's what Paul is saying here. Christianity is not a movement to, oh boy, it's not a movement to improve government. It's not a movement to help clean society up or to clean up the town. Christianity's role, its singular function, is to preach the gospel, and it's the power unto God to salvation for individuals. Our role is to bring individuals into a personal salvation with their God, and God will change them from the inside out, and person by person, one by one, until an entire society and a government is changed. Historically, this has been done over and over. It's not some experimental thought process. The nation of Rome was changed to where Christianity, by the early 300s, was the state religion of Rome. There was not one civil unrest, one violent overthrow attempt of a Caesar involved. They loved people as best as they could where they were at. They respected the government authority, even when that same government authority was trying to kill them. And that love changed people one by one until the entire Roman Empire was changed. Therefore, we must be subject. Not only because we fear the punishment of God or of government, but because we know God commands us to do it, and it's simply the right thing to do based on what God says. So let's get into this. And taxes. Render taxes when it's due. We're supporting God's work in government to rule over ourselves when we pay our taxes. It is the right thing to do to pay taxes. Again, shocking. Your IRS agent is a minister of God who's been ordained and placed in that position for a purpose. Oh, I'm not paying my taxes. I'm part of the God, guns, and Bitcoin movement. Oh, I'm not paying taxes. I'm getting out anyway. You know what? What kind of ungodly things that they do with my tax money? The sin that they spend. I'm not supporting that. I'm not paying my taxes. And what do you think the money sent to Caesar Nero was used for? Build Christian hospitals, orphanages, schools, You got to be kidding me. Tax money to Nero was going for every kind of ungodly evil that you can't even begin to imagine. And yet Paul says, pay your taxes. And by the way, flip side of the coin, if you're in government and you're in the tax collection side of government, taxes collected are to be used by government for a job of first and foremost restraining evil and keeping society orderly. That's the role, primary role of taxation. It's not to enrich the government themselves through pet projects and giving your buddies contracts. It's your primary role in government is to protect the people, keep orderly society, restrain evil. And you're going to be held accountable if you don't use the tax money collected in that way. So we're just give the state money, honor, proper reverence, which are due to the state because God ordained them. All the while, we can reserve the right that God comes first. Classic example of this, write down Matthew 22:21. Short version is this. People were fussing time of Jesus. The Jews were so sick of paying the Romans. Romans were dictatorial and ruled them with a heavy hand and would go around collect people like the mafia enforcers. And you go around collect your taxes, and they were just sick of it. And they wanted to catch Jesus. They were going to get him either to say that it's not legit to pay taxes to Rome and agree with us, or we're going to get him to say to pay taxes to Rome, and then he's a traitor to the Jewish people. We got him. Perfect trap. The Jewish leaders had them all set up. So they go, hey, what about paying taxes to the Romans? And they did this in a public arena where Jesus would be put on the spot. Of course, how are you going to put God on the spot? Jesus says, let me see a coin. So they gave him a coin, a Roman coin. He holds it up. And he said, whose face is on that coin? And all the guys are trying to set him up go, Caesar's. And he says, then give to Caesar's the thing that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's. Classic comeback. Pay your taxes. Pay your taxes. Jesus never overturned the respect the authority and pay your taxes. He said, pay your taxes. Give to God what belongs to God. Give to Rome what belongs to Rome. We must show honor. And here's where we all get busted. If you got through this broadcast and I didn't offend you yet, and you agree with everything I said, and you're the 5% of the viewing audience, both live or on YouTube later, that thinks, oh, he didn't nail me. Okay, here's your turn. Have to show honor to the government. Every civil servant, every person, any branch of government, we're to show honor to. Paul actually provided a negative example of this in Acts 23:5. Paul is being brought before the Jewish leaders and they're trying to roast him over the coals. Paul's feisty and he's a really good arguer. Paul said something extremely disrespectful to the Jewish leaders. He got slapped for it. And you know how Paul retaliated? He apologized because he quoted in Acts 23:5, he said, I was wrong. The scriptures say, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So the example that we have of disrespecting verbally your leadership was a negative example provided by Paul himself. And he corrected himself and apologized. So, how many times, especially in our country, especially with free speech, especially the last 20 or 30 years when things have become so divided in our country, that SOB, name your political opponent, mudslinging, name calling, I can't stand that, I can't, and fill in the blank, whoever your pet person is that you hate, guess what you're supposed to do? Honor and respect the office and not speak bad about them. The guys in the military, if I remember this example correctly, is you may have a commanding officer, a superior officer, who is a complete dirtbag in material, in shoes. I mean, this guy is so unfit for command, and yet he's your commanding officer. And I believe you guys are taught, if I get the quote right, you salute the uniform. In other words, it's not the person in the uniform who may be a complete moron, but you salute the office, you salute the uniform. And guess what we're supposed to do with our leaders according to the Bible? We're to honor our rulers and pray for them and not sling mud of them. So do we ever disobey and disrespect our government? Yeah, we don't disrespect them, but we sometimes have to disobey them. Yeah, not disrespect, but disobey. They command you to go do something that's clearly a sin. You can't do it. You got to obey God. And there's going to be repercussions, but this time it won't be from God. It'll be from man, but you're probably going to get punished for it, for taking that stand. It's happened throughout history. But 99.9% of the time, when you do something against your government, either slander them or do something like that, you're not only incurring the wrath of your government and man, you're going to incur the wrath of God if you read Romans 13. There's no wiggle room. You're on God's wrong side. Now, in a democracy, there is a sense where we are the government. We help govern ourselves in a democracy like we have. So we participate in the democratic process, but we participate through the legal means of participation. We vote, we campaign, we do peaceful protests, we do write-in campaigns, because that is the nature of our particular government. We are to be absolutely engaged in governing ourselves. But engagement is not revolution. January 6th. Throughout history, Christians have tried to rationalize this infidelity to the state by saying that Paul simply couldn't have understood what he was talking about because he didn't know how bad we have it now. He couldn't possibly have foreseen the circumstances of my country XYZ today. Really. No background. Our friend Paul, living under Nero. Nero's mother, Agrippina, was the sister, you might remember this name, of the Emperor Caligula, one of the most wicked in terms of personal depravity of all the Roman emperors. Sexual orgies, and the entertainment provided would be the torture and killing of thousands of people just for pleasure. That was his sister, Agrippina. Agrippina was the mother of Nero. Agrippina was this wonderful lady. She had Nero's stepfather assassinated by feeding a bowl of poisoned mushrooms. Well, good thing it stopped at that generation, that Nero overcome the sins of his parents and his uncle. Nero killed his stepbrother Britannicus when he was only 14 years of age. Later on, Nero began to be concerned about his mother Agrippina trying to exercise authority over the throne, so he killed his own mother. Nero killed Agrippina. Oh God, well, it's got to stop here. Okay, maybe she was a wicked lady. All right, finally, it's over. Well, don't be married to Nero. His first wife, Octavia, was banished to an island and then later killed. Oh, what about his second wife? Did things get better for her? Pompeia? Nope, slew her too. So in light of this, Paul was dealing with the most despotic, horrible, sinful government structure possible. These are his instructions. These are his instructions. So, Corson finishes with this one quote. One day, all societies is going to fall apart. Jesus is going to return, and everything's going to be reset. And we need to understand that our priority is not to change the world, our government, our culture, our society, our TV, our Hollywood. Our role is to change a person one at a time. And as we change somebody one at a time, bringing them into the kingdom of heaven, one by one, societies will be changed, Hollywood will be changed, cultures will be changed, all will be changed. But this is our emphasis. Our emphasis was on the kingdom, one person at a time. All right. What we're going to do, we've got 2 minutes, which isn't enough time for discussion. So there'll be a session 3 today. And Dan, I'll run session 3. So you don't need to worry about recording it, because we probably won't record the Q&A. But we've got 2 minutes. So we'll kick it off, and then I'll have to cut you off, and then we'll literally restart, but we won't record the 3rd session with comments, and not because I don't respect your comments, but because I don't know how to do it. Take yourself off mute. And you don't have to come back for a 3rd session. I'll just offer it to you. I'll be here. If nobody signs back on the first 5 minutes, I'll just sign off. Questions? Comments? Stone throwing? Corson, in his closing comments, I didn't read the quote, but basically says, just go back and read the scriptures. Read the Acts. Read the epistles. Read the Gospels. Show me anywhere where it's the Christian duty to change the government, to be involved in civic government issues, that's the main role of the church. You just show it to me. It's not in there. You simply aren't going to find it. And yet, because we're Americans, we have a particular problem with this. Now,
Wow.
To stimulate conversation so that some of you will come back for the 3rd session, this bothered me. Obviously, it probably bothers some of you. I thought about my particular country. Now, this is not going to bother somebody maybe from China or Russia or even England, but it bothered me. It bothered me because if you look at how we were established as a nation, it began with revolution. It's called the American Revolution. And you would be surprised the amount of material that's written on whether our country has been blessed because of the way we were founded or in spite of the way we were founded. So I will see you back here in just a couple of minutes if you're interested in that little diatribe. Plus, I'd love to hear your comments on this. And so session 3, back in a minute.